Sound test 1, 2. Confirm test 1, 2. Sound check confirmed.
Very short. All right. Good morning. My name is Chris Kang. I'm with Demand Justice, and I'd like to welcome everybody to stop 23 of the Just Majority Tour. We have been in 16 states, plus the District of Columbia, 11,088 miles over the last 2 months, from Boston to Westchester to I could do all of these states. I won't go through them all, but we've been all the way out to California, to Texas, to the great state of Georgia, where you'll hear our next speaker from, and back up here to Washington, D.C., to make the case that democracy demands a fair and ethical court. We have seen time and time again this court and these Republican justices make decisions based on politics rather than the law, and we see every single day yet another corruption scandal coming from this Supreme Court that demands change. And I am so excited here, as one of the measures of change we're calling for is Supreme Court expansion, to add 4 seats to the Supreme Court. Congress has changed the size of the court 7 times before, and it takes a piece of legislation. We have a bill pending in Congress right now called the Judiciary Act that has 66 co-sponsors already, and it's been introduced by our first speaker here today, Congressman Hank Johnson, the leading Democrat of the House Courts Subcommittee, and if there's any issue on the courts, Congressman Johnson is taking the lead in reform, whether it's Supreme Court expansion, term limits, ethics, accountability for harassment and discrimination, expanding our lower courts. Congressman Johnson is leading that effort in the House of Representatives. We're so delighted to have him here. We were delighted to have him just 2 weeks ago in Atlanta, making the case to his constituents. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Congressman Hank Johnson, the lead House sponsor of the Judiciary Act. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm happy to be here with Just Majority and all of our stakeholders and our Senate and House partners to highlight the attack on liberty and freedom that ironically emanates from the dark money, corporate-captured Supreme Court of the United States behind us. And if the American public didn't already know it before, it was driven home once again yesterday by yet another ProPublica report showing a billionaire mega-donor, this time vulture capitalist and hedge fund owner Paul Singer, showering Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito with luxury travel, and the justice failed to disclose it. It's becoming clearer and clearer that American democracy has been for sale for a long time, and we still don't know the full story. But we do know that our democracy is undermined by what has now become a constant flow of revelations documenting the failures and refusals of Supreme Court justices to hold themselves to the same standards of ethical conduct that all lower court judges must follow. These reports about undisclosed, all expense paid luxury vacations taken by Justices Scalia, Thomas, and Alito undermine public trust and confidence in the rule of law upon which our democracy is predicated. That's why Congress should act now to pass my legislation that would expand the United States Supreme Court. And that's why we also need to pass legislation that imposes term limits on Supreme Court justices. And that's also why we need to pass Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and mine CERT Act, H.R. 926, the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act of 2023. I'm proud to lead the Judiciary Act with Senators Markey and Smith. The fact is that the United States Supreme Court poses a clear and present danger to our voting rights, our civil rights, and our reproductive freedom. Indeed, this court, as currently constituted, poses a threat to life itself. It has eviscerated the ability of state and local governments to regulate the flood of guns onto our streets. And it has gutted the ability of the EPA to protect our air and water quality from pollutants. And it's all the brainchild of Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. Over the past 40 years, the Koch brothers, Harlan Crow, Paul Singer, and other top 1%ers have funded the Federalist Society and other entities that have been involved in a scheme. The scheme is to build a pipeline, starting with law school, indoctrinating young would-be lawyers in crony capitalist free market doctrine, then placing these ambitious young lawyers into Federalist Society jobs at white shoe law firms and prosecuting offices, and then elevating them to the bench. This 40-year scheme has produced 5 Federalist Society Supreme Court justices and 1 Federalist Society Chief Justice. We can't afford 20 or 30 years of this 6'3" extreme, radical, activist right-wing court to evolve into moderation. We must expand the United States Supreme Court now. We must do it now. The court's radical right-wing justices have spent years dismantling our democracy by bestowing First Amendment freedom of speech on corporate dark money. This court has enabled dark money to control elections. To solidify dark money control over policy making, the court has been steadily chopping off the protections of the Voting Rights Act, while authorizing racial gerrymandering under the guise of partisan gerrymandering. And last year, the court stripped tens of millions of women of their right to reproductive freedom. Next on the chopping block, the freedom of LGBTQ people to love who they want to love. It's why a record number of Americans have lost confidence and trust in the United States Supreme Court, and they want change. They want Congress to do something. Last session, when I first introduced the Judiciary Act, which would add 4 seats and expand the Supreme Court to 13 justices, I had only 2 original co-sponsors. Last month, I reintroduced the Judiciary Act, this time with 57 original co-sponsors. Now, we're up to 62. Momentum is building for court reform, ladies and gentlemen. Congress has changed the number of justices 7 times in the nation's history, and it's time for Congress to do so again. Given their lack of restraint, their arrogance, and given their activism, and given their lack of adherence to precedent, and given their lack of accountability to the public whom they serve, the time is now for court reform. It's time to expand the court and require it to follow and be bound by a code of ethics. Before I turn it over, I just want to thank Just Majority once again. I want to thank Demand Justice, all of the hard work that all of the organizations have been doing to amplify the voices for change. Thank you so much. And now I will turn it back to Chris Kane.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman Johnson, for your leadership, and momentum is definitely building here because of it. You know, Congressman Johnson has set the stakes here for how important it is for us to reform the Supreme Court. What is at stake? We see issues from reproductive rights to gun violence prevention to climate change on the line here. And in addition to the Judiciary Act being introduced in the House of Representatives, we also have a companion bill led in the Senate by Senators Markey, Tina Smith, and Elizabeth Warren. We are so excited to have Senator Smith joining us here today, the only member of Congress, certainly the only senator who's ever worked at Planned Parenthood as a Planned Parenthood executive. She has seen the day-to-day impact of women coming into the clinics, what it means to have the right to bodily autonomy, the right to make the most important decisions of their lives. She understands the impact of the court, and more importantly, she understands that our democracy is broken, that this court is broken, and when something is broken, as she says, it's up to us to fix it. And so we're really excited here to introduce Senator Tina Smith from the great state of Minnesota, who also joined us for a stop in Minneapolis on our tour, one of our 23 stops. Thank you very much, Senator Smith, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Whoa, here we go. This is big. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. I want to thank Demand Justice and the Just Majority Coalition and my Senate colleague Ed Markey and all of my colleagues from Congress that are supporting this important piece of legislation. And mostly, I want to thank the activists and the organizers that are using their power and their voices to lift up this issue and help us come to grips with something that is fundamentally important to understand. So I am here today because I understand that the Supreme Court is an essential foundation for our democracy and for the rule of law. And I understand that it is broken. And when you are a citizen of a great democracy and you realize that something is broken, you can't just turn away, you can't just wring your hands. You have to be willing to get down and make a commitment to fixing the problem. The Supreme Court has an essential constitutional role in our democracy. Its job is to be the final arbiter of justice and the rule of law and protecting the rights guaranteed in our Constitution. And to fulfill this role, that's right. To fulfill this role, it must be seen by the citizens of this nation as fair and ethical, as calling balls and strikes, as Justice Roberts once famously said. But today, the Supreme Court has become too powerful and too political. It is doing the work of extremist, right-wing conservatives and anti-choice activists and big corporate interests. For decades, dark money groups and the Federalist Society and the Republican Party have been working to politicize the Supreme Court, and it worked. This weekend marks the one-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, which overturned 40 years or more of law protecting in the Constitution the rights of people to make their own decisions about their own lives and their own bodies without interference from politicians. And the Dobbs decision was stunning, but it was not surprising. We can see that it is part of this long, decades-long effort to turn the Supreme Court into the partisan and I would say corrupt organization that it is today. Republicans stacked the court with these political jurists put there by Donald Trump while protecting themselves ultimately from the accountability that they would have for trying to move things forward through legislative process. This court gutted the Voting Rights Act. This court put forth for us Citizens United, which means that there is no way for us without amending the Constitution to get dark money out of our politics. And the court has been extremely damaged by the ethical lapses of Justice Thomas and Justice Alito. We just saw more about this yesterday, showing that with no ethics code apparently in place, they are accepting massive gifts from right-wing mega donors that are also the very same organizations that are funding the dark money groups that have captured the court. So, we know what to do in this moment. We have a common sense, clear understanding of what it is that we can do. We can restore balance to the Supreme Court by adding 4 justices. This is just common sense. It exercises the power that the Constitution gives to Congress, which is to set the number of Supreme Court justices. And by expanding the court, we can restore balance to the court, and we can also restore people's faith that this court will be truly upholding the rule of law and not just advancing the extreme right-wing agendas of the political forces, the right-wing forces that put this court into place today. So we know what to do. We have a call to action ahead of us, a call to organize, to lift up this issue, to help people to understand how important it is that our United States Supreme Court is truly standing up for the rule of law and not just for the special interests of the powerful few. So thank you so much for being here today. This is important work that we must complete and we must do together. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Senator Smith. This is our 23rd stop, and we have heard from across more than 40 elected leaders in our country, including more than 20 members of Congress. But I think one of the most powerful stops we had was early on in the tour in Newtown, Connecticut, which obviously is the site of the horrific mass shooting at Sandy Hook. And one of the speakers at that stop, I'm so excited, is joining us here today. Poe Murray is chairwoman of the Newtown Action Alliance and has been fighting for gun violence prevention ever since. And, you know, at this very moment, you know, in the Supreme Court, they're considering whether or not to hear a case that would allow people who have domestic violence restraining orders to be allowed to carry firearms, to strike down the current restriction that prevents them from having a firearm. That's how extreme this is getting with respect to our inability to address gun violence prevention because of this Supreme Court. And it's just one of many reasons why the Supreme Court needs to be reformed. It's one of the many reasons why leaders like Poe have stepped up and joined this tour and joined this fight. I'm so delighted now to introduce Poe Murray from Newtown Action Alliance.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to Just Majority for having me here. So my name is Poe Murray, and on behalf of the Newtown Action Alliance, we are here to demand that Congress pass the Judiciary Act right now. Our lives depend on it. On December 14, 2012, shortly after my 11-year-old son hopped onto his school bus, my 20-year-old neighbor used an assault weapon, AR-15, and high-capacity magazines to hunt and killed 20 children and 6 educators in Sandy Hook Elementary School. 12/14 was our 9/11. It was the darkest day of our lives in Newtown. Our hearts were shattered into a million pieces. We knew then that if a mass shooting could happen in a community like Sandy Hook, then it could happen anywhere, again and again and again. Since Sandy Hook, over 1 million Americans have been shot. There have been over 4,500 mass shooting incidents, and there have been 300 cases of mass shootings already in the first 6 months of this year. Annual gun deaths increased from 33,000 to 49,000 in the last 10 years. And a recent FBI report showed that 2022 had the most active shooting incidents in the last 5 years. Children everywhere are stolen from their families too soon. Guns are now the #1 killer of American children, more than car accidents, more than cancer. Gun violence is a public health crisis that is impacting all of our communities. White supremacists with AR-15s are hunting and killing Black Americans in Buffalo, New York, and Asian Americans in Allen, Texas. It doesn't matter if you live in a red or blue states. Bullets don't discriminate. While more Americans die, the gun industry continues to push its extreme and greedy, any guns to anyone everywhere agenda. Connecticut and many states passed gun control measures after Sandy Hook, and Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act after Uvalde, Buffalo, Highland Park shootings last year. But now, our life-saving gun laws and our lives are in jeopardy. Last year, the Supreme Court justices, who are owned by the gun lobby and the industry, overturned a New York gun permitting law that was in place for over 100 years. They removed the rights of states to regulate guns in public places for the first time ever. The Supreme Court's deadly decision in the Bruen case is now being used by conservative activist judges in lower courts to overturn common sense gun laws. Recently, a Texas court relied on the Bruen case to decide that it is unconstitutional to ban domestic abusers from possessing guns. How does that make any sense? If that decision stands, then thousands of dangerous domestic abusers across the nation will be armed. More and more women and children will die as a result. After the Supreme Court gifted the gun industry with an unethical and very controversial Bruen ruling, the gun lobby is already suing Connecticut to repeal our assault weapons ban legislation that was passed to honor the Sandy Hook victims and to prevent another mass shooting tragedy. The Supreme Court justices decided that they could rewrite the Constitution to protect guns, particularly AR-15s, more than children. What happened to the rights of our kids and educators to go to school without getting shot? Are their lives not protected in the Constitution? Our freedom to live is enshrined in the Constitution. Sadly, the Supreme Court can now be bought easily. The NRA, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and the gun industry use millions of dollars of blood money to buy their radical ruling that would make it easier for anyone to carry guns in public. America already has 400 million civilian-owned guns, more guns than all men, women, and children in our nation, and it has not kept us safe. I stand with all gun violence survivors and communities across the nation to demand that Congress expand the Supreme Court to protect our children and our loved ones more than guns. The current Supreme Court is incapable of pursuing justice for the most vulnerable in our nation. Many of the justices have soiled the institution with unethical violations on top of playing politics with their rulings. It is time for Congress to restore the court's legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Poe. When it comes to Supreme Court expansion, it all starts in Boston. Our lead sponsor in the Senate is Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and so when we launched the Just Majority Tour in April, there was no better place to launch than in Boston. Since then, we've been to 23 stops, 11,088 miles to arrive at this point where we're continuing the fight to demand a fair and ethical court. Senator Markey, one of the many things that I've learned from you and have picked up as you have led this fight is what you say often. When it comes to times like this, we can't just agonize, we have to organize. And that is really something that I have taken, that we have taken on in this fight. And so appreciate your leadership and being here today. Thank you, Senator.
Wow, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to the Just Majority for bringing us here today. I joined this formidable coalition to launch the tour in Boston. And I am proud to be back here today to close it out in Washington, D.C. I'm honored to be joined here by my Senate partner, Senator Tina Smith, and from the House of Representatives, I know Congressman Hank Johnson has already spoken, and we have many other members of Congress who support this effort. There are many powerful advocates with us today, standing shoulder to shoulder in this fight. We are here because we know that the Supreme Court is in crisis. We are here before the steps of the highest court in the country at its lowest point. New polling released yesterday shows that record numbers of Americans have lost faith in the Supreme Court. Over the course of the past decade, the conservative majority of the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly attacked the foundations of American democracy. From voting rights, campaign finance laws, reproductive health, and gun violence, to environmental regulations and more, this court has put the rights of all Americans at risk, especially black and brown and indigenous people, women and immigrants, and LGBTQ rural and low-income communities. The court has become unethical, unaccountable, and out of control. Republicans stole 2 seats and packed the court with partisans. It is no longer the institution it once was. The American people have lost respect for the court, and for good reason. But when something is broken, we just don't agonize. We organize to fix it. And that's why we're here, making our voices heard from Boston to Washington, D.C., and at more than 20 stops in between, to demand a fair, balanced, and expanded Supreme Court that works for the American people and not just for the wealthy and powerful in our country. It is time to expand the court and reclaim the stolen seats. It is time for the court to adopt a binding code of ethics. It is time to restore legitimacy to the court. The extremist right wing will not stop, but neither will we. So let's start with undoing the theft of the 2 seats on the court by restoring balance with 4 additional seats on the court. Congress can do that by passing our bill, the Judiciary Act, to expand the Supreme Court, rebalance it, and begin to restore Americans' confidence in it. Expanding the court is constitutional. Congress has done it before, and Congress must do it again. We need to clean up the court as well. We've seen Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito make a mockery of the public trust. We know that they just continue to refuse to comply with financial disclosure laws and recusal requirements. This has to end. We must ensure that no other justices can abuse the system again. So our message to the Supreme Court is simple. Get your house in order, or Congress will do it for you. This is a time of constitutional crisis in our country, and I am grateful to stand here today, shoulder to shoulder, with powerful advocates who love our nation, love its people, and who are committed to the fight to fix the court. When we fight together, we will win together. So I thank the Just Majority campaign. We are going to see a continuing string of decisions from this Supreme Court. Last year, it was the Dobbs decision, but they're going to be making decisions on student debt. They're going to be making decisions on whether or not there can be real gun safety laws in our country, on environmental laws, on voting rights laws, on civil rights laws. They are going to be making decisions that undermine the rights of people. Justice Thomas said that not only is the Dobbs decision something that had to be revisited, but that the right to contraception had to be revisited as a constitutional privacy right of Americans. So we know that what has happened in the past is just a preview of coming constitutional atrocities that will emanate from this court. We must expand the court in order to ensure that we reclaim the 2 stolen seats, ensure that we get back the 2 seats that Joe Biden and Barack Obama were not able to name as new justices, and then reclaim true constitutional protections for all Americans. This is a critical time in our country's history. We're going to continue this fight until we win. Thank you.
Thank you again, Senator Markey, for being here, for launching our tour, and for your incredible leadership on this legislation. When Senator Markey says that we're standing shoulder to shoulder with powerful advocates, he's talking about people like our next speaker, Savanti Myrick, who is an elected leader, the youngest mayor ever elected in the state of New York, and now is president and CEO of People for the American Way, which is leading the fight for fair and balanced courts. And I admit, I didn't realize this until last night. It's People for the American Way, but actually they stand for truth, justice, and the American way. And I think that that is really the fight that Savanti and his organization really embody. And so excited to invite him up to the podium next. Savanti Myrick.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Savanti Myrick. I'm the president of People for the American Way, an organization that for 4 decades has fought for a justice system and a court that we can all trust and respect. That fight is more important than ever because seemingly every day, look, I don't have to repeat what all of the previous speakers have said, but seemingly every day we find out about another ultra-conservative super donor, another super yacht, another private jet, another unreported trip, another ethical violation, another breach of centuries of tradition and conduct. And we now have to tolerate the very justices who are breaching the ethical code, lecturing us about the integrity of the court. They're saying that the reason we are criticizing them, the reason we are here today, Justice Alito just said this yesterday, is because we are the ones that want to undermine the court. That we, for some reason, don't want Americans to trust and respect the court. Ridiculous. You know, I grew up, I think like a lot of us, revering the court. We read our history books. We read our textbooks. Thurgood Marshall was a patron saint in my household. We had confidence that no matter what kind of kickbacks and bribes the politicians might be tempted with, these lifetime appointees were not going to be on the private jets of billionaire donors. Yet here we are. They are the ones undermining the courts. We are the ones fighting for a future where all kids who tour this building will have trust and faith that the people inside it are above partisan politics. We are fighting for a future. In fact, we fought last year for a future in which people like my little sister, I could see in Thurgood Marshall myself, or perhaps my grandfather at any rate. And now my sister, my little sister, can see in the highest court of the land one of the most accomplished, impressive, inspirational jurists who happens to look just like her. That is what we're fighting for. We are the ones that want the courts to work. People for the American way want the Supreme Court to truly be trusted and respected. And yes, they're right. We mistrust this majority because in the few short years since Donald Trump, who got fewer votes than everybody he ever ran against, appointed 3 out of 9 Supreme Court justices, yes, they've already stripped many rights away from us, most importantly in the Dobbs decision, which took a woman's right to choose away from her. But A simple dislike for majority opinions is not what brings us here. What brings us here is the demand for binding code of ethics. What brings us here is the demand to expand the court. What brings us here is the simple idea that transparency and accountability should apply to the lowest school board member and to the highest justices in the land. So we will not stop fighting, no matter how uncomfortable it makes Justice Alito, no matter op-eds he writes in the Wall Street Journal. We will keep fighting for accountability because we, the people of America, deserve it. Thank you all for being here. Much appreciated. I hand it back now to Chris.
Thanks again, Savante, for joining us and for your leadership and everything that People Forward does with respect to our courts. When we took our bus all the way out to California, we, of course, had to stop in Irvine so that our next speaker could pull up in her minivan and join us at our stop. I'm so excited to introduce Congresswoman Katie Porter. When it comes to corruption, and there's no question this Supreme Court is corrupt, when it comes to calling out corruption, there's no better fighter for us in Congress than Congresswoman Katie Porter, and so it's no surprise that she, too, has joined the call for Supreme Court reform and Supreme Court expansion. So incredibly honored to introduce our next speaker, Congresswoman Katie Porter from the great state of California.
Thank you very much. Okay, hang on. Is it not on? Do I have to start again? We are here to fight for a Supreme Court that delivers liberty and justice for all. That is not where we are today, which is why we are here. The Supreme Court is corrupt. It does the bidding of big donors and dark money, not the will of the American people. This is an institution in crisis, and it demands a response that recognizes the moment that we're in. This Saturday marks 1 year since the Dobbs decision that reversed nearly 5 decades of freedom. 5 decades of freedom for every American to make their own healthcare decision. That is a somber reminder of what is at stake when we talk about what is happening in the building behind us. There is concrete harm in people's lives when the Supreme Court is hijacked by extremists. Constitutional law is not an abstract thing. It is part of people's real lives, their real opportunities, and their very real freedoms and rights. There is potentially more to come. In just a few minutes today, we could get opinions in any number of cases that continue the corrupt reversal of Americans' rights. We could see decisions that give businesses the right to discriminate against LGBTQI Americans, setting back the fight for equality, for equal justice under the law. We could see decisions that enable extremist lawmakers to choose their voters instead of voters choosing their leaders. That's an attack on democracy, which is fundamentally about equal justice under the law. We could see a decision that takes away student debt relief for tens of millions of Americans, which not only hurts students, but handicaps the ability of our president and our leaders to deliver the policy help that families need. Already this term, we have seen a Supreme Court that rolled back the Clean Water Act, eroding the government's authority to go after polluters that threaten the waters that we use for drinking and fishing and recreation. There's no higher duty than the government to keep people safe in their communities, and that includes safe access to clean water. And we have a Supreme Court that is standing in the way and attacking the ability of Congress to do its job. Dangerous decisions like this one put Americans at risk. The problem here is not that the Supreme Court is conservative. It is that, as I said at the beginning, it is corrupt. Democrat, Republican, Independent, young, old, brown, black, white. No American should want its democracy, its government, to be corrupt. Just this week, we found out that yet another Supreme Court justice went on a private jet ride with four people who had cases pending before the Supreme Court. Litigants offering plane trips that cost $100,000, more than twice what most American families make in a year, in order to get in front of those Supreme Court justices and try to shape the agenda and the decision-making of the court. That's not just nonsense. That's gross. That's morally wrong. Americans are outraged, and they should be. The American people deserve better from the supposed highest court in the land. They deserve a highest court that holds itself to the highest moral standards. That is what this fight is about. Americans increasingly see the Supreme Court as corrupt. They are starting to see what has been true year after year. The institution is in the middle of a legitimacy crisis. And the question is, what are they going to do? The answer, sadly, is exactly what we as Americans make them do. We must hold them to account. This is our court. It is not their court. I have helped spearhead legislation that would strengthen ethics at the Supreme Court by banning justices from trading stocks in businesses who come before the court. I've backed other legislation to implement term limits, institute a code of ethical conduct that is enforceable, and increase the number of justices, because there is too little justice in this country. We need to keep up the pressure. Not just today, every day. This is a fight, and it is a fight for the very values of our country. I am proud to be side by side with our partners in this fight and grateful to them for helping to highlight people what is at stake in this country if we let this court continue down its path of corruption. I am ready to see a Supreme Court that works for the American people, that delivers equal justice under the law, and I am so grateful to every one of you and for all of our partners today for being part of this fight. We will win. Democracy will prevail. This will again become our court, a court that we are proud to stand in front of. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Porter. The Just Majority campaign has 43 partners, including 8 who are supporting Supreme Court expansion for the first time, highlighted by our next speaker. Minnie Timuraju is the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America. She has been a leader in the fight for reproductive rights, gender justice, racial justice throughout her entire career. I'm especially delighted to be able to call her a longtime friend. Our next speaker, Minnie Timuraju from NARAL.
Okay, I'm going to try to keep up that Katie Porter energy. Hi, I'm Minnie Timuraju, the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America. Thank you for having me join you today. Look, a year ago, this court behind me, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, overturned Roe v. Wade, plunging our country into a national health care crisis. Already, 20 states have eliminated or severely restricted access to abortion because of abortion bans. But like we've said all along, abortion bans don't just hurt people who need abortion care. They hurt pregnant people, families, and entire communities. Right now, in red states across the nation, pregnant people are being refused care until they're at death's door. Doctors are fleeing states hostile to abortion, and hospitals are closing entire maternity wards, only making the dire maternal health crisis worse. These bans are real, and they are harming real people, especially communities of color and others who are historically marginalized. The horror people are experiencing didn't come from outer space. This didn't just happen to us. The people who occupy this building, the Supreme Court's 6 conservative justices, they did this. We knew exactly why they were put on the bench, and the Dobbs decision has reaffirmed to Americans that we cannot count on them to protect us and our freedoms. They know the decisions the court is handing down aren't fair, and they're not impartial. Anti-abortion zealots have taken advantage of our country's broken court system to continue their attacks on reproductive freedom, despite the fact that the majority of Americans support abortion rights. And in the last few weeks, we've seen poll after poll after poll from organizations like USA Today and Gallup showing that more Americans support abortion rights historically than have ever had in the history of this country. The problem doesn't just stop with our nation's highest court. We're seeing it in Texas, where extremists are working hand in hand with a Trump-appointed judge to ban access to the abortion pill. And we're seeing it across the country. Our democracy is facing a crisis. Attacks on all of our fundamental freedoms, not just abortion rights, are moving at a light speed through the federal courts because extremists know the system has been rigged in their favor. This is undemocratic. It's against the will of the people. And it's time we had a fair and ethical court. We cannot do that without court reform, and that includes court expansion. And that's why NARAL is proud to fight alongside our partners through the Just Majority Coalition to do just that. We're here today because we know that our democracy and our freedom to live our lives under attacks of the courts, our freedom to decide when, if, and how to have a family, to raise our family in safe communities, to breathe clean air, to have our kids grow up in safety, we must refuse to let extremist judges interfere with our freedom to determine our destinies. Together, we can build a future we want to live in. We can reclaim our rights and restore the legitimacy of the court. And it's not even just an option, folks. We must do this, and we must do this now for our kids' futures and for our immediate rights in the 20 states that have abortion bans. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again, Minnie. We have, for our next speaker, Congressman Brendan Boyle from Philadelphia. When we stopped in Philadelphia, he actually stood in the pouring rain for 40 minutes at that stop, which is an amazing event with Martin Luther King III and Andrea Waters King and Yolanda King. But I'm so excited. Maybe the good luck is that having Congressman here today, the rain has held off. So I'm excited to introduce Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I already got a Go Eagles chant, so I feel at home, even though I'm in D.C. But it's wonderful to be here with such an important organization that is needed now more than ever. I keep nervously looking at my phone, as I sense a lot of you are as well, to see what the latest round of destruction this Supreme Court will bring us. But don't worry, no matter what the Supreme Court decides today, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas and others can still continue hanging out with Harlan Crow and their billionaire buddies. I mean, you want $10,000 student debt relief? Oh, no, we need to scold you. But 10 times as much money, 100 times as much money can be spent whining and dining Supreme Court justices. What a complete and utter sham and joke. But I do want to thank certain members of this Supreme Court because they have made the argument for judicial reform and ethics reform far more eloquent by their example than I could with words. I think this is an issue that really should have been talked about more, in retrospect, decades ago, but we are where we are now. We had a wonderful event, as was mentioned, in Philadelphia with Martin Luther King III and other members of the Kermit family, Professor Kermit Roosevelt from the University of Pennsylvania, a number of local elected officials. More and more people are getting what used to be an abstract issue. That we have right now in this country a Supreme Court that has become the most dangerous branch of government. And you know, this is not the way other Western democracies work. They don't have a situation in which their parliaments and their executives sign pieces of legislation, vote on them, and then suddenly 9 unelected, unaccountable people who, just because they're wearing nice fancy robes, decide to impose their will on the people. That is not the way representative democracy is supposed to work. So we need judicial reform. There are a number of pieces of legislation that are out there. I think I'm a co-sponsor on all of them. This needs to become more of a mainstream issue, which we're already starting to see more and more. I can't believe the progress that has been made in terms of the need for judicial reform over the last couple of years. But Mr. Alito and Mr. Thomas, we couldn't have done it without you. So I hate to interrupt your opulent fishing trips and the hunting trips, you know, just like regular Americans spending times on million-dollar yachts going around the world. By the way, the funniest part of this at all is Clarence Thomas actually helped me decide which excuse is more humorous. Clarence Thomas justifying it, his lack of disclosure, by saying, well, Mr. Crow is a friend of 25 years. Forgetting that Clarence Thomas has been on the Supreme Court for 30 years. So it's clear why Mr. Crow suddenly became friends with Clarence Thomas. Or was it Samuel Alito who, in his defense of his being wined and dined, saying, well, if I didn't take that seat on the private plane, it just would have gone empty. So clearly there was nothing wrong with me being jetted around on a private plane. If any member of Congress did that, we would be hauled in front of the Ethics Committee, but not the Supreme Court, because they don't believe any ethics laws should apply to them. It is wrong. It needs to change. And the arrogant actions by individual Supreme Court members, combined with their out-of-touch decisions, will end up bringing about, finally, judicial and ethics reform for the court. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Boyle. You know, I'm sitting here refreshing my phone because right now the Supreme Court is issuing decisions, and one of the most important decisions that it has left to issue is regarding student debt and whether or not it will uphold the president's clearly constitutional ability to cancel student debt. And so we're really excited now to have Nick Marshall, an organizer for Debt Collective, to talk about why they too have joined the Just Majority campaign. Nick?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. My name is Nick Marcil. I'm an organizer with the Debt Collective, the nation's first union of debtors, standing here with the Just Majority Coalition. And, you know, I also want to thank a lot of the other, senators, congressmen, and everyone else who's here today, right? There were a lot of people who highlighted student debt cancellation right here and right now. As I stand here outside of SCOTUS, 45 million people in this country hold student debt. And literally within minutes, within an hour this morning, we could hear a decision on Biden's first iteration of student loan debt cancellation. Over 20 million people could see all of their student debt wiped out by Biden's 10K/20K promise. For instance, people like Pam from Detroit, who I recently met, who's 72 years old and holds $10,000 in student debt from 1999. We know that this debt intensifies existing inequalities in society. Those who rely on debt the most for everything from housing to health care to education. Black adults and women bear the highest student debt burden over time. They pay higher sticker prices for the same degrees white people and men. For these reasons, Biden's proposed plan was a major attempt to chip away at racial wealth inequality. It was no wonder that within weeks of Biden's policy announcement, half a dozen right-wing lawsuits sued to stop the president's program. And then the main lawsuit blocking student debt cancellation went up. It was rushed up to the highest court in the land here. And it skirted basic fact-finding, discovery, and, there were plaintiffs that offered just as much as it stands to reason to justify claims that, this purported potential damage to a loan servicing company's bottom line was reason enough to block student debt cancellation, urgently needed by millions in this country. The student debt case before the Supreme Court is not actually about whether Biden can cancel debt. It is about whether the plaintiffs, the 6 Republican attorneys general, can reasonably prove that canceling millions of people's student debt harms corporations in their state, and whether judges are stacked and unethically accepting their lies. We have seen through this partisan decisions and repeated ethical violations that the Supreme Court is actively undermining our democracy. This is fueling a crisis of legitimacy at the court, and it must be addressed now. An unaccountable and unethical majority seems to behave as if rules don't apply to them. Just this week, we learned, as other people had highlighted, that Justice Alito has taken bribes from Paul Singer, a venture capitalist who's made billions of dollars from buying up debt from countries like Argentina, and just for pennies on the dollar, shutting down hospitals, shutting down schools, and, putting people into poverty just in order to pay an unjust debt to a 1% investor. Paul Singer has an interest in this Supreme Court case for student debt cancellation, and himself has funded groups that are suing or that are trying to stop student debt cancellation. We are here today because the justices on the Supreme Court know the outcome that their billionaire benefactors want, and the debt collective knows that SCOTUS's decisions are too rarely about justice. And on the precipice of a decision set to impact tens of millions, there is no better time to demand to expand and reform the court. That's why the Debt Collective is proudly here today as a part of the Just Majority Coalition. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. The Judiciary Act to expand the Supreme Court has 66 co-sponsors now. 15 of them are new this Congress, in part because we have a new generation of leaders who have come to Congress, including our next speaker, Congressman Greg Casar from Austin, Texas, who's already been elected to be whip of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and is really whipping the entire Congress and all of us on progressive issues and values, including Supreme Court expansion. Excited to introduce Congressman Casar.
Just hit this up. Hi, y'all. I'm Greg Casar, and I'm proud to represent the heart of Texas. And Texas has a long-standing history of bringing important cases to the Supreme Court, fighting against injustice and expanding rights for all Americans. Roe v. Wade was a case litigated by a 20-something-year-old lawyer named Sarah Weddington, who sued Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade, brought that case to the Supreme Court, and won, winning the case Roe v. Wade, winning abortion rights for people all over the country. It was oftentimes voting rights cases in Texas that got rid of racially gerrymandered districts across the country. It was activists in Texas that were blocked out of their basic voting rights by segregation and Jim Crow laws that helped win the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But then after those important wins in our recent history, right-wing billionaires got together and wanted to turn this Supreme Court, once a sanctuary of abortion rights, into a graveyard of reproductive health. They wanted to turn this building, once the home of voting rights, into a playground for special interest and right-wing billionaire money. And we have to fight back. It is one of the most key issues that constituents in my community don't yet know we should be talking about, but they're talking about it all the time, about the loss of protections for our environment, about the loss of our freedoms, about the continued anxiety and feeling that anything good that our democracy tries to get done, that right-wing billionaire money could try to get it undone through a packed Supreme Court and through a strategy that has been ongoing for decades. But we have a chance to bring our history back, to have a Supreme Court again that is free of corruption and that is more interested in protecting our rights rather than trampling our rights. And so if we want our kids to have more protections than gun manufacturers, we need to expand the Supreme Court. If we want to have a future where our kids can have a clean, healthy planet with union jobs, then we need to pass the Judiciary Act. If we want to have a world where women have more of a say over their own health care rather than right-wing politicians and justices, then we need to expand the Supreme Court. That movement is growing. We have more co-sponsors than ever before. And we will continue to push until we have a branch of government here in the judiciary that respects the rights of Americans, that evolves to meet our needs, and aren't controlled by special interest money, people that instead of going on resort and luxury trips are instead working on making sure they're taking care of the everyday American. Thank you all very much.
Thank you again to Congressman Kassar. Did I just turn that off? No. All right. Thank you again to Congressman Kassar. Our next speaker is the most influential and inspirational leader in Supreme Court expansion. He also happens to be my boss. Brian Fallon, Executive Director of Demand Justice.
Good morning. So in addition to this week representing the culmination of this terrific bus tour that has taken us to 23 stops over the last 2 months, we had another breakthrough here on Capitol Hill just yesterday in the aftermath of the ProPublica report on Sam Alito. Dick Durbin, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, announced that after the July 4th recess, the Senate Judiciary Committee will finally be marking up ethics legislation in the Senate. And that's a big breakthrough that a lot of us that are participating in this tour have been pressuring the Senate to act on that ethics legislation for several months now. But it's finally happening. And you might ask, well, can that legislation go anywhere considering that the House is in Republican hands? And this Congress, probably not. Even though that ethics legislation is, there's bipartisan versions of ethics bills in the Senate, even though it's highly popular, 80% of the public supports a mandatory code of ethics for the Supreme Court, even though it should be a nonpartisan no-brainer, we know that Republicans in the House that are in league with the MAGA justices on the Supreme Court will surely block it. But two things, I just want to bring attention to two things that I think are happening right now in this country that will help us get this done, not just on the ethics bill, but on the rest of the Supreme Court reform agenda that this bus tour has been promoting. The first thing is this historically unpopular Supreme Court has become a political anvil around the ankles of Republicans that are trying to keep the House in 2024 and retake the Senate in 2024. I think that this issue has never been more politically salient. All the polls are showing us that Democrats are now more motivated than Republican voters when it comes to the Supreme Court. Independents are siding against the Supreme Court, and they view the House Republicans and the Republicans in the minority in the Senate as doing the bidding of these Republican justices that are handing down these highly unpopular decisions. And so they're going to be an anvil around the ankles of these Republicans on the ballot in 2024. This issue's never been more salient. You will see Democratic candidates for office running against the Supreme Court and using it as a cudgel against their Republican opponents. So there's a legitimate chance to not just retain the Senate and keep the White House, but also flip back the House into Democratic hands in 2024. And the Supreme Court as an issue will help do that. That's number one in terms of what's happening. Number two is if the Democrats do regain an opportunity to have another governing window in 2025 because of the Supreme Court in part being such a highly partisan issue that will help Democrats get elected in 2024, if that governing window reopens in 2025, we now have a consensus to act on Supreme Court reform, on term limits, on a mandatory code of ethics, and day by day growing support for expansion, such that this is going to be at the top of the agenda the next time Democrats have an opportunity to truly pass something in the House and the Senate. And so this bus tour has been about further building that consensus about what a Supreme Court reform agenda should look like, so that over the next 18 months we have an opportunity to not just use this issue to help elect more Democrats in the House and the Senate, but then to put this at the top of the agenda in 2025. So that markup that's going to happen next month in the Senate Judiciary Committee, it might not advance much further than that this Congress, but it is a marker for what's to come in the next 18 months if we continue to work hard. And so grateful to all the people that have been part of this bus tour, all the 40-plus organizations that joined the Just Majority Coalition, all the 40-plus elected officials that took part in the various events, this great staff that put this tour together. Thank you all. You're all making it possible that in 18 months we're going to get something passed through both chambers of Congress and signed by a freshly reelected President Biden. That's my prediction. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Next up, we have Christina Harvey, Executive Director for Stand Up America. Stand Up America is fighting and demanding the democracy we deserve, so it's no surprise that they have been in this fight for Supreme Court expansion from the very beginning. I'm proud to introduce Christina Harvey.
Thank you. Good morning. I am here on behalf of Stand Up America's nearly 2 million members who are fighting across the country to expand our freedom to vote, to reduce the influence of money in our politics, and to push back against the escalating threats to our democracy, including this corrupt, hyper-partisan Supreme Court. The Supreme Court looms large in our work. We're standing here in front of the court today on not just any day, but a decision day. And every decision day, we hold our collective breath, waiting to see whether and how this court will undermine our democracy or our fundamental rights. To say that the Roberts Court has damaged our democracy in recent years is an understatement. This court has unleashed unlimited corporate spending in our elections, infinitely multiplying the voices of wealthy individuals over the voices of everyday Americans. This court has twice gutted the Voting Rights Act, opening the floodgates for racially discriminatory laws that restrict access to the ballot box. And because of this court's willingness to put partisanship and the interests of their wealthy benefactors over our rights, this court will continue to be a threat to our democracy if we do not act. To protect our fundamental freedoms, including our freedom to vote, we must restore balance to this court. The fastest way to do that is by expanding the court, specifically by passing the Judiciary Act to add 4 seats to the court. Then, to root out the corruption that has overtaken the headlines over the last 3 months, we must pass, Congress must pass a code of ethics for this court, just like every other federal court. Our members have sent over 500,000 emails to their members of Congress and logged thousands of phone calls demanding these reforms. Why? Because they understand that these reforms are not radical. They are common sense. What is radical is the Supreme Court's overturning of precedent to deny us our basic human rights. What is radical is sitting around and continuing to let this court undermine our democracy, roll back centuries of progress, and to let women die, all because of the decisions of 6 individuals, 5 of whom were appointed by presidents who did not even win the popular vote. Congress has the power and the responsibility to rein in this out-of-control court, and they must use it. Thank you.
All right, next up we have another one of the founding fighters for Supreme Court expansion, the Center for Popular Democracy, Co-Executive Director Ana Lilia Mejia.
All right, y'all. We've had a lot of speakers, and so I'm not going to repeat the obvious, or maybe I will. We know that we are in the middle of a crisis. No one should avert their eyes from what is happening in this Supreme Court and in our government as we speak. Quite plainly, it is obvious to many that our Supreme Court, the third leg of U.S. government, has essentially been taken over by radical activists and are executing a very clear power grab that threatens American democracy, point blank. This is not hyperbole. This is truth and fact. This court has made decisions that enhances its own power, overriding regulatory agencies, overriding the White House, overriding Congress, overriding state and local governments, and overriding the American people. Its rulings have upended precedent and democracy in order to curtail environmental protections, restrictions on regulating firearms, limiting public health initiatives, on issue after issue. They have told us who they are. They are not patriots. They are not democracy embracing individuals. They are not even ethical. At the same time, this court-backed power grab has been happening. We have been receiving drip after drip of instances, clear instances of unethical, immoral, deceitful actions by people who we are supposed to trust to uphold the law and ensure that we in fact have a democracy and the ability to claim self-governance in our country. These justices want to believe, perhaps they want to believe, that the reason the wealthy, the well-connected, the powerful want to be their friends is because they're charming and witty. And I am here to let them know, I'm going to tell them like it is, that's not the case, my friend. What attracts the powerful to this court is that there are members willing to sell out the American people for a painting, for maybe a boat ride, a plane ride, a house for their mama. I am just going to close. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. So I'm fired up. I hope you are too. It is clear to all of those who see that this unethical behavior must be stopped if we are going to preserve our democracy. It is clear that someone's personal enrichment should not trump our ability to participate in a real popular democracy, and that they may not be allowed to dismantle concepts, ideas, and justice that frankly have never come to full fruition for all Americans, but they are putting everything in peril for every single one of us by their actions. So I ask all of you, will we allow the lure of these pretty things that these individuals, particularly Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, seem to not be able to resist? Are we going to allow the lure of these unethical and unpatriotic justices destroy democracy? Or are we going to instead reform the court, hold its members to higher standards, enact ethical codes, institute term limits, and expand the court to save democracy? I think the answer is clear in what we have to do. Thank you very much. Handing it back.
Thanks so much. I'm definitely fired up. Next up, we have Greg Jackson from the Community Justice Action Fund. You think about the impact of the court on gun violence prevention. Greg and his organization are leading the movement building when it comes to fighting for gun violence prevention, and so excited to have them as one of the leading GVP organizations in the fight for Supreme Court expansion as well. Greg, thanks for joining us.
All right, good morning. All right, we can wake them up at least. Good morning. All right, good evening, everybody, or good morning. I'm Greg Jackson, Executive Director for Community Justice Action Fund, and we focus on addressing gun violence in black and brown communities, not because it's an ideal issue to take on, not because it's something that's flashing across the news every day, but because it's literally life or death for black and brown communities. And I learned this firsthand in April of 2013, where I was shot after a conflict literally 6 blocks from here. The bullet that hit me hit 2 arteries, and I nearly died after my injury. And I'll never forget when I arrived at the hospital, I wasn't faced with my nurses or doctors. I was met with investigators that questioned me about my innocence before I could go into surgery. And when I finally met my surgeon, I only had about 26 minutes to live. And so I literally almost lost my life while being interrogated as law enforcement tried to solve a crime and find justice. But since then, we haven't seen that type of justice for black and brown folks like myself, or the nearly 1 million people that have been shot or killed in America since I was shot in April of 2013. And while those might be numbers to you, those are friends and family to me. Since then, 5 of my mentees have been shot and killed. Karan Brown, Devon McNeil, Chakai Snyder, Kevin Knight, and DeMarcos Pinckney, who was actually killed this past weekend, only 3 miles from here. This also includes so many others. We're losing black grandmothers in Buffalo. We're losing Korean shoppers in Allentown, Texas. We're losing elementary kids in Uvalde. And despite all of that, we still don't seem to see that there's anyone fighting for justice behind these walls behind me. Gun violence has now become the #1 cause of premature death for all youth in America, the #1 cause of premature death for black men in America, the #2 cause of death for black women, and the #2 cause for Latino men. And since 2019, we've seen a 45% increase in gun-related homicides across the country. This crisis is now costing our economy $557 billion every year. And so while Supreme Court members are, hanging out with billionaires and laying out in the sun on their yachts, and communities like mine, young black boys are laying on the sidewalk fighting for their lives. The Supreme Court has been failing to provide justice for our kids, justice for our communities, and justice for our country. Failing by overturning a New York gun safety law that stood for over 100 years and was a major benefactor of how we've been able to reduce violence in New York. They've removed the rights for states to regulate guns in public places that could have prevented the shootings of folks like young girls in Chicago. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. I'm just thinking a little bit too much about DeMarcos, but could have saved DeMarcos' life. The deadly Bruin decision is now being used by conservative judges in lower courts to overturn true life-saving gun laws. And we're also watching Texas courts use these cases to declare it unconstitutional to even prohibit domestic abusers from having a firearm. And so I just stand before you asking, when will we'll see real justice? Justice for our black youth, justice for all youth, justice for our communities, and justice for our country. Because right now, this is literally life or death for too many of us every single day. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Greg, for sort of reinforcing the life and death situation that this court brings us. Sometimes we think about this as a broader policy issues, but really the impact that this has on everyday Americans. I am really excited now to introduce Congresswoman Cori Bush, who kicked off our event in St. Louis, about mile 3,000 of our 11,000-mile journey. She is a member of the Judiciary Committee, one of the 4 leading sponsors of the Judiciary Act in the House, and definitely bringing an organizer's mentality to that committee and her leadership as well. Congresswoman Cori Bush.
Thank you, Chris. All right. Well, good morning, and thank you to everyone for being here. I am delighted to be here with all of the advocates, and I know I've missed some of my colleagues, and to all of you, to be here to mark the end of the Just Majority bus tour, which has galvanized support for court reform around the country over the last few months. I was proud to join the Just Majority Coalition at its event in St. Louis on May the 8th, where I stood alongside Mallory Schwartz, Brittany Cunningham, and Alencia Johnson and spoke about the need to expand the Supreme Court to restore balance to the judiciary and to our democracy. In St. Louis, I talked about the scandals we had just learned about involving Clarence Thomas, Neil Gorsuch, and John Roberts' wife. In my remarks, I said, these are just the scandals that we know about. And there could be entirely different scandals that have yet to be publicly uncovered. Well, here we are. Another week, another Supreme Court scandal. Just this week, ProPublica revealed that a billionaire flew Justice Alito to Alaska for a luxury fishing trip. That billionaire is a major donor to right-wing dark money groups and later had business before the court. But Alito never disclosed the trip or recused himself. Why did he never disclose such a trip? Why didn't he recuse himself? Shameful. These justices want us to believe that their corruption was perfectly ethical, even though they covered it up all of these years. And they are clearly outraged. You know, they're pissed that we're finding out about it and that we are holding them accountable. Well, I've got news for them. We're not going anywhere, and we will continue to hold them accountable. If the U.S. Congress has to abide by a code of ethics, so should the Supreme Court. The truth is, we need to hold them accountable because the safety and the well-being of our communities depend on it. It is terrifying how much power these corrupted judges wield over our daily lives, people who they will never meet. Just think about it. People in the pocket of billionaires will soon rule on affirmative action. They'll rule on student debt. 1 year ago tomorrow, they stripped away your freedom, our freedom, to reproductive health care. They have gutted public sector unions, climate regulations, gun restrictions, labor protections, and almost everything else opposed by who? Big business. We all know that's not a coincidence, right? As I have said before, these decisions are devastating for communities like mine, for communities like St. Louis. That's why I'm standing here today as a proud co-lead of the Judiciary Act, which would expand the Supreme Court to restore the balance to the court and our democracy. And ultimately, this is about our democracy. This movement, we know, is growing just in the last few months as the Just Democracy bus tour has traveled the country and visited communities like mine in St. Louis. We've seen the many members of Congress and advocates who are joined together in this struggle to free ourselves. Free ourselves from the anti-democratic control of a racist institution that once ruled that black people were not U.S. citizens, and that ruling happened in my district the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision in 1857. If we actually want to achieve the words that are written on the front of the court behind me, equal justice under law, we must pass the Judiciary Act. We must pass systemic court reform. We must double down on our fight to secure our rights and stop the far right and its captured court. Thank you to Brian Fallon, Chris Kang, Katie O'Connor, the entire Demand Justice and Just Majority teams, my colleagues and the advocates, all of you all who are here today. This bus tour, it may be ending, but the movement for a fair and ethical court has really just begun. I'm grateful for this partnership and for this movement. Together, we will make sure that the needs of our communities are not trampled by corrupt judges who don't care about them, and again, who will never know their names, who will never even know they existed, but hurt their very existence. And we will reclaim our democracy, and we will do it once and for all. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Doug Linder, Senior Director of Judiciary and Democracy for the League of Conservation Voters.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to Katie and Brian and everyone at Demand Justice for your incredible leadership in this critical Just Majority campaign. My name is Doug Linder, and I am Senior Director of Judiciary and Democracy at the League of Conservation Voters. We at LCV believe in the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and pass on a sustainable world to the next generation. We know that our environmental laws need judges who will enforce them, judges who will follow the law, instead of putting their thumbs on the scales of justice for big oil and big coal. And that is why we support expanding and rebalancing the United States Supreme Court with 4 new justices who work for the people and not the polluters. Because make no mistake, the MAGA majority on this captured Supreme Court does not work for the people. They've made that very clear. And I'm not just talking about the private jets and the yachts and the free housing for Clarence Thomas's mother. I'm talking about their cases. Last month, they embraced the extreme demands of big polluters to dramatically narrow the scope of the Clean Water Act, rolling back half a century of protections for our wetlands, our streams, our right to drink clean water that doesn't make us sick, and the critical protections our wetlands provide against flooding, especially amid the climate crisis. Last year, they fabricated the so-called Major Questions Doctrine, a vague, hand-wavy rule with no basis in actual law that lets them veto regulations they just think are too important to go forward. And of course, they used it to narrow the EPA's authority to fight the climate crisis under the landmark Clean Air Act. Next year, they'll consider upending a long-standing fundamental doctrine that allows the EPA and other agencies to make decisions based on science and expertise and laws passed by the people's representatives instead of the MAGA justices' political agendas. And these cases are not just about the environment, as if that weren't enough. They're not just about taking power away from the EPA and the agencies that protect the people's health care, labor, consumer protection, financial regulation, and so much more. They're about taking that power away from the Congress that was elected to pass those laws, from the president who was elected to administer those agencies, from the voters who elected them, so the MAGA justices can take that power for themselves. Power they can use in bad faith to serve the polluters, corporations, and far-right extremists who helped them capture this court. Power they will wield for the rest of their lives. But Congress can stop them. Congress must stop them. We need Congress to pass the Judiciary Act. We need to expand and rebalance this stolen, dangerous, corrupt Supreme Court. Because until we do, the oceans will continue to rise. Our democracy will continue to backslide. And our fundamental rights will be taken from us. The people deserve a high court they can trust. And we at the League of Conservation Voters are proud to stand with our Just Majority allies in fighting for it.
All right. Thank you very much, Doug, and to LCV for all your leadership on Supreme Court expansion. Next up, we have Allison Gill, Vice President for Legal and Policy at American Atheists. Thanks so much, Allison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Gill, Vice President for Legal and Policy with American Atheists, and we're a national organization that fights for religious equality, separation of church and state, and the civil rights of non-religious people. And sadly, over the last several years, this radical, ideologically biased, unethical majority on the court has ripped the Establishment Clause out of the Constitution and bulldozed the separation of religion and government. Church-state separation is a fundamental part of our system. It's essential to religious freedom. You don't have freedom if the government can just impose their favored religious beliefs on you. And yet it's also essential to our democracy. Everyone must be an equal citizen, not just those of the favored religion. And yet the Supreme Court has, over the last decade, declared that some businesses have religious rights that must be protected, that a 40-foot tall cross on public land is somehow not religious, that religious groups must be included in every government grant program, and they cannot be denied benefits given to other groups, even to protect the separation of religion and government, that states must fund religious schools through school vouchers, even if the education they offer is pervasively religious, that those same schools have a nearly unfettered right to fire employees, ignore labor protections, and discriminate, violating civil rights laws. That churches cannot be subject to public health restrictions aimed at stopping the spread of dangerous disease if any secular organization is not restricted, even if they're not at all similar. That a policymaker speaking in even minor negative ways about religion may be caused to overturn their decisions or government actions, shutting down the free speech rights of politicians to criticize religious actions. And that religious people and groups have the right to sue federal employees personally for violating their rights, even though that's not available to other plaintiffs that are not religious. Last term was the worst yet, where the court took a case about a public high school coach coercing his students to pray, and instead misleadingly portrayed the facts to make him look like the victim. Justice Sotomayor even inserted a picture in her dissent, which is not a common practice, just to visually demonstrate the lies that were put forth in this case. This decision struck down the important legal test to protect against violations of church-state separation and threw open the doors of schoolhouses across our country to religious intrusion. And now the court is on the verge of striking down critical civil rights protections, not just for LGBTQ people, but for everyone, and extending special employment protections to religious employees while everyone else has to cover for them. Because of these and other decisions favoring religion over all other freedoms and rights, our system has become more vulnerable to the rise of white Christian nationalism. If we care about religious freedom, if we care about our democracy, and if we care about the constitutional separation of religion and government, then court reform is essential. I want to thank Demand Justice and the other groups here, and the lawmakers, of course, for supporting these important legislative efforts, and we really do need to reform the court today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Allison. When we think about the Supreme Court and when and why a lot of us came to the reform movement, we think about Citizens United. And so I am so excited to introduce Portia White, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at End Citizens United and Let America Vote, who also joined us in Atlanta and is here again today as part of the Just Majority campaign. Thank you.
Hey, y'all. My name is Portia White. I am with End Citizens United, Let America Vote. And every day I get to work to protect the voice and the vote of all Americans, that our democracy works for all of us. So right now we're talking about this Supreme Court that is completely corrupt, right? We have these scandals that are coming out pretty much every week at this point surrounding different justices, including Clarence Thomas and now Alito, and all of these different ethical concerns that we're having with a court that is making laws about the rest of our lives. Right now, these corruptions have shed light on a deep-rooted corruption problem within the Supreme Court, and we can't afford to turn a blind eye any longer. Justice Thomas and his questionable conduct have only served to reinforce what many of us have suspected for years, that our judicial system, The very institution that's supposed to embody fairness and integrity and impartiality is rooted in corruption. It's time for reform and it's time for change now. Clarence Thomas's agenda on the court is very clear. More money, more corruption, and less transparency. So it's no surprise that he's at the center of one of the most damning scandals in Supreme Court history. We know that he's used his position to line his own pockets, to jet set around the world on private planes and exclusive yachts. He's been doing this to enrich himself, his wife, and his family. What we don't know is what he's done in return for his benefactors, but I think we can take a couple of guesses, because we know that he keeps ruling on the side of billionaires and corporations, and it's all been coming at the expense of the rights and freedoms of regular Americans every single time. Clarence Thomas and the extremist conservative justices have made a mockery of ethics laws and guidelines designed to uphold the integrity of the court. And I think the American people have started to notice, right? That's why the trust in the Supreme Court and the confidence in the Supreme Court is at its lowest level of all time. He's destroyed the people's trust in the court, and they must be held accountable. Congress must act today. We need a full investigation into every gift, every trip, every conflict, and every case that these justices have been working on. But it shouldn't, like I said, it should be with all of the justices, right? Like, not just Clarence Thomas. We have to fix the court itself. We need to pass real ethics reform for the nation's highest court. We deserve to know who has business in front of the court and what their financial relationships are with the justices. It's no wonder why Americans have lost faith in this court. It's been doing the bidding of the big donors while stripping people of their rights, like making the decision over our own bodies and our reproductive rights. Any minute now, any day now, we could hear that the Supreme Court has decided that tens of thousands of Americans, including me and a lot of people who look like me, don't deserve student loan debt relief. We could also hear that affirmative action is no longer needed, which will affect people who look like me the most. This weekend will mark 1 year since the Dobbs decision, which was the devastating effect of a decades-long extremist dark money effort to spend over $1.1 billion to radicalize the federal judiciary. And as a Mississippian who has been fighting for reproductive rights for a long time, I was able to see the effects of Dobbs way before the decision came down, because again, this is a long-standing effort. They've packed the Supreme Court with extremist partisan judges and pushed through a decision to overturn many of our rights and freedoms every single day. We have to come together now to raise our voices and demand a Supreme Court that truly serves the interests of the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Portia. Next up, we have the one and only Megan Hatcher-Mays, Director of Democracy at Indivisible.
Hi, it's true. It's me. I'm Megan Hatcher-Mays. I'm the Director of Democracy Policy at Indivisible. And I am here to fight back against the Supreme Court's attacks on our democracy and our fundamental rights. It's not just that the Supreme Court occasionally rules poorly, it's that they are actively undermining our democratic rights, our ability to vote, and our ability to participate in the democratic process. It's not good, folks. It's really not good. So the building we're standing in front of says equal justice under law, but I really, if you paid me, couldn't think of a worse description of what goes on in this building. So sure, the wealthy friends of the justices, the guys who can afford private jets and flights and lavish trips to Bali and elsewhere, their access to justice is just fine, doing just great. And in fact, their access to the justices themselves is pretty secure too. There's plenty of justice to go around for polluters, for bosses who attack workers' rights, for extremists who are, using their religion as a shield to discriminate against LGBTQ people. But for the rest of us, the unwashed, if you will, the people who do not have private jets, who do not have fancy multi-level yachts, the kind of yacht with their own boat, people like that, less justice to go around. Justice is in short supply for the rest of us. So at the same time that these justices are engaging in some of the most comically corrupt behavior I have ever seen, like worse than Nixon, and maybe a little bit worse than Donald Trump, or at least equal, they are stripping us of our fundamental rights. First, they came for our right to vote. They said, well, we don't really like the Voting Rights Act anymore. In fact, John Roberts at the time said, things have changed dramatically in the South. And yet, within 24 hours of John Roberts gutting the Voting Rights Act, state legislatures in red states, with surgical precision, the court said, made it more difficult for black voters and voters of color to vote. So things have changed dramatically in the South, but why? Because we passed the Voting Rights Act, and John Roberts said, we're good. We don't really need that anymore. I don't think that's right. Does anyone here think that that's right? No, of course not. So first they do that. First they come for our voting rights. Then they come for our abortion rights, our bodily autonomy, our reproductive rights, our ability to make decisions for ourselves what we want to do with our own bodies, because they know it will be more difficult for us to fight back at the ballot box because they've already done what now? Made it more difficult for us to vote. So now they're stripping away our other fundamental rights now that they have the chance. They're calling corporations people while they're telling actual people they don't matter. They're accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in free gifts from MAGA donors, including tuition payments for members of their own family, while at the same time they're getting ready to tell us that we don't deserve student debt relief. The theme of this term seems to have been, well, it could have been worse. They could have destroyed workers' rights more. They could have killed off the VRA entirely. It could have been worse. But don't we deserve better than that? Don't we deserve this term was good, or the decisions were fair, or I believe in the legitimacy of the outcomes from this court because the justices are not corrupt? But we can't say any of that because they are corrupt and they aren't fair, and they're making decisions that are not rooted in the Constitution and the law. They're making decisions rooted in their own partisan political beliefs. The best we can say right now is it could have been worse. So I say we can dream a little bit bigger than that. I think we can dream a little bit bigger than it could have been worse. Let's expand the Supreme Court. Let's add 4 seats. Let's undo the damage that this conservative majority has done to our democracy and to our fundamental rights. Let's add those 4 seats. They have stolen our rights with the help of dark money forces and MAGA loyalists, and we don't have to stand for this. Congress has the constitutional authority to perform oversight over this court and to change the number of justices sitting on it at any time. So let's get serious about that. Let's get serious about fixing this court, because this is not just about passing disagreements. It's not that my favorite color is green, Brett Kavanaugh's favorite color is red, and that's why I want to add 4 seats, because we disagree about what's the best color. That's not what this is about. We disagree about whether or not I deserve my fundamental constitutional rights, and Brett Kavanaugh doesn't think that I do. That's what's at stake. They don't think we should be able to participate in our democracy. They don't think we should be able to unionize at work. They think we should drink dirty water. This is not a matter of a surface dispute about statutory interpretation. This is about the soul of our country being under attack by this body that is supposed to be an equal member of our democracy, but they are actively undermining it at every turn. So equal justice under the law hardly feels like a fitting motto for this court or what goes on here. Let's fix that. Let's expand the court. Let's pass the Judiciary Act of 2023. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Megan. Next up, we have one of the leading partners here for Supreme Court expansion has been Take Back the Court. And so we're very delighted to have Mia Patel, Senior Advisor to Take Back the Court, to be our last speaker here to close us out. Mia.
Thank you so much. Great timing. Yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Maya Patel. I am a Senior Advisor to Take Back the Court Action Fund. And I know a lot has been said today, and I know you've heard a lot. Oh, there we go. Thank you. A lot has been said today about how this court has so much wrought, and all of that is true. From climate change, gun safety, workers' rights, access to the ballot box, and of course abortion. And all of that has been talked about today. But what I really want to talk about here right now is what else it could be on the chopping block. Right now before us, as we speak, LGBTQ rights, student loan debt relief, affirmative action policies, these all continue to be on the chopping block, right? And we see that. And here's the thing. Even our hard-won victories, which are few and far between, are coming on issues that should never have been up for debate in the first place. Things like tribal sovereignty, fair elections free from racial gerrymandering, that have long been core tenets of our democracy, were in question during the Supreme Court term. They shouldn't have been up for debate. And still, some justices ruled against these. So what are we doing? The direction of this court is heading is unsustainable. As the new study shows, as of right now in the current system, the court won't change hands until 2065. 2065. If all this damage was done in 1 year, imagine what could be done in 4 decades. We don't have time, and we don't have 4 decades. That makes our future bleak. It makes it dark. But we don't have to sit on the sidelines. We can do something about that, and we can take back the court. We can bring back the independence, the balance, and the integrity that this court deserves. And that's why we're here today. And that's why I'm so proud for just the amazing, amazing turnout, rain or shine, of all the amazing leaders and advocacy groups that Take Back the Court is so proud to be part of, including Senators Markey, Smith, Johnson, Barragan, Cesar, Jayapal, Lee, Porter, and all the others, right? Including all the great groups, including Demand Justice and all the other groups that are here today. We are just so grateful to be part of such an amazing core group that is bringing light to this really important issue. A few years ago, when Take Back the Court was founded, my colleagues told me that expanding the court was nothing but more than a pipe dream, is what they were told. And if I'm being honest, it started as a pretty lonely fight. But look at us now. Look at how many groups you've heard from today, how many amazing members you heard from today. And we all have the same goal, to expand the court and save our democracy. Our coalition is broader and stronger than ever before, and it's only going to get bigger and stronger. We are not folding. We're fighting to fight the fight. We're going to win, and I'm grateful for everyone's time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mia, and thank you to everybody. This wraps up the Just Majority bus tour part of our campaign. Again, 16 states, the District of Columbia, 11,088 miles all over the country to make the case for why the Supreme Court needs to be reformed and why we need to add seats to restore balance and ensure that it is less political and more accountable. And so thanks to everybody, all 43 partner organizations who've joined us, and everybody who logistically make this possible. Excited to put this tour in the books. Thanks.